They said these files would never see daylight. For decades, they stayed sealed, thousands upon thousands of pages, each one marked with the indelible stamp of national security. Only a select few even knew the extent of what lay hidden: the internal memos, the spreadsheets of shadowy funding, and the coded instructions that made entire governments rise or fall at a whisper. But times change, and so do the fortresses guarding these secrets. Now, with more once classified documents declassified or leaked, we're starting to glimpse the labyrinth of covert operations that shaped our modern world in ways most of us never imagined. In the next few moments, we'll trace the footprints of an intelligence apparatus that spun an enormous global web, extending from high society cocktail parties in Europe to the sun-scorched farmlands of Latin America. Think you already know the story? Think again. You might have heard rumors that everything is not as it seems in government, but the reality is more gripping than any spy novel. These files shed light on the hidden networks, the real-life James Bonds, and the embassies teeming with double agents. If you're ready to learn the truth behind the facade, let's begin our deep dive into an era that's defined by suspicion, secrecy, and the relentless drive to outmaneuver every rival. When you picture an embassy, you might imagine a stately building, possibly ringed by security fences, with flags proudly displayed at the entrance. Inside, teams of consular workers handle visas, trade representatives negotiate deals, and political officers gather updates on local affairs. On the surface, it's all quite proper. Little do most visitors suspect that within these ornate corridors, entire espionage networks might be lurking. The documents in question finally confirm what many had whispered about for years. What political officer was, in numerous instances, code for undercover CIA agent. Such individuals enjoyed diplomatic immunity, granting them the freedom to hold clandestine meetings, slip crucial materials through diplomatic pouches, and even oversee sensitive operations under the veneer of standard diplomatic duties. They would attend social functions, like embassy dinners or national holiday receptions, where they could observe, recruit, and quietly direct local informants. One statistic stands out among the newly revealed files. In multiple embassies, nearly half of the individuals working in the so-called political sections were intelligence officers. For instance, in France, the number of CIA personnel disguised as diplomats reached over 100 at one point. Imagine that, over 100 covert operatives, each trained in advanced interrogation, surveillance, or subterfuge, all operating on foreign soil under the watchful eye of local authorities who scarcely realized the extent of it. If you dig into cables and internal memos, you find references to monthly status updates, in which these agents would account for how many new assets they'd cultivated or what strategic meetings they'd attended. The bland State Department job titles did little to hint at the real nature of their tasks. For multiple years, local politicians and average citizens remained in the dark, and even some legitimate diplomats occasionally found themselves out of the loop. By design, only a few insiders had the full picture. One statistic stands out among the newly revealed files. In multiple embassies, nearly half of the individuals working in the so-called political sections were intelligence officers. For instance, in France, the number of CIA personnel disguised as diplomats reached over 100 at one point. Imagine that, over 100 covert operatives, each trained in advanced interrogation, surveillance, or subterfuge, all operating on foreign soil under the watchful eye of local authorities who scarcely realized the extent of it. If you dig into cables and internal memos, you find references to monthly status updates, in which these agents would account for how many new assets they'd cultivated or what strategic meetings they'd attended. The bland State Department job titles did little to hint at the real nature of their tasks. For multiple years, local politicians and average citizens remained in the dark, and even some legitimate diplomats occasionally found themselves out of the loop. By design, only a few insiders had the full picture. These new disclosures confirm that the CIA's covert operations were more than a set of standalone missions. They formed a sprawling network stretching from Rome to Rio de Janeiro, to the sands of North Africa, to the peaks of the Andes. Officially, the CIA's mission was to gather intelligence and safeguard national security, but the lines often blurred between defensive strategy and active manipulation of foreign events. Where exactly did protecting American interests end and undermining sovereign nations begin? In Europe, many files reference efforts to weaken perceived communist leanings within political parties, labor unions, and even religious institutions, particularly in countries where the local Communist Party held notable influence. Observers in Italy, for example, worried that Soviet sympathizers might gain ground in the Vatican or shape policies that favored Moscow. Consequently, the CIA quietly financed certain groups, circulated targeted propaganda, and cultivated well-placed informants who could tip off intelligence officers about any forthcoming ideological shifts. Shifting to Africa, the files speak of alliances with local strongmen who controlled valuable resources, oil fields, diamond mines, you name it. According to these newly unredacted pages, the agency weighed moral concerns against strategic gains, often prioritizing the latter. In some instances, they bankrolled warlords deemed anti-communist, even when these leaders themselves engaged in questionable practices. Once the intelligence community designated a group as essential for halting Soviet expansion, that group received covert funding, arms, or training with minimal public scrutiny. And then there's Latin America. If Europe and Africa were fields of operation, Latin America was a veritable playground. American policymakers saw the region as their backyard, and the CIA poured immense resources into making sure it stayed free from communist, or even mildly socialist, influence. One of the largest clusters of newly released records focuses on covert infiltration in countries like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Bolivia, Chile, and more. Whether you're talking about rigged elections, sabotage of rival political parties, or funneling money to loyal generals, these files capture the sheer variety of clandestine methods in play. Of all the revelations that have come out, few are as dramatic and far-reaching as those that emerge from Latin America. They detail one-of-a-kind missions, code-named with cryptic labels, spanned years of planning. We'll look at a few prime examples momentarily, but keep in mind, the deeper we dig, the more puzzle pieces we uncover, and the bigger the overall picture gets. Latin America is a region whose 20th century political history is replete with pivotal coups, revolutions, and social upheavals. In numerous cases, local populations believed they were grappling with purely domestic issues, class tensions, ideological rifts, or battles over natural resource exploitation. Not until later did evidence emerge that powerful outside forces, including the CIA, were stoking these fires for their strategic gains. The newly released documents confirm this to a striking degree. Take the example of Cuba. After Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, U.S.-Cuba relations collapsed spectacularly. Yet the CIA's interest in the island predated Castro's government and grew exponentially once he aligned with the Soviet Union. Rumors circulated for years that American intelligence tried nearly every method under the sun to eliminate Castro, from outlandish exploding seashells to lethal poisons. While the CIA's official tally of attempts is lower than the famed 600-plus figure, the truth remains that multiple attempts were made, often with the assistance of Cuban exiles harboring intense bitterness toward Castro's regime. The new files underscore the creative extremes and note that while many plots failed at the planning stage, the ambition never quite subsided. Removing Castro was a near obsession for certain hawks within the U.S. government. Cuba aside, the Dominican Republic stands out as another flashpoint. Officials worried that dictator Rafael Trujillo, though initially aligned with U.S. interests, had grown too erratic and damaging to American diplomatic credibility in the region. Meanwhile, in places like Bolivia, the CIA supported certain military factions that pledged to suppress any Marxist-leaning movements. Rather than let these countries proceed with internal developments free from external meddling, the U.S. government bet that shaping political landscapes behind the scenes was a lesser evil, allowing a perceived communist foothold. The real question is whether local people had any say, or even know how heavily their destinies might have been influenced by foreign intelligence networks. The release of JFK-era documents has triggered fresh waves of curiosity. If so many secrets from the 1960s lay buried for over half a century, what else is the government still sitting on? Activists, historians, and journalists alike have ramped up calls for broader declassification, a push that extends well beyond the Cold War, touching on everything from civil rights-era surveillance to foreign conflicts in the decades following. Yet calls for transparency often collide with the entrenched culture of secrecy that still permeates various intelligence agencies. Even when official guidelines mandate periodic reviews of old classified materials, bureaucrats can invoke broad exemptions under the guise of national security. Critics contend that the overuse of secrecy fosters abuse of power. If the public rarely sees the dirty laundry, how can anyone hold officials accountable? Meanwhile, some policymakers worry that releasing too much might damage modern diplomatic relations. Imagine you're an ally, newly discovering that the U.S. once stuffed your embassy with secret operatives, or that certain local leaders you respected were on the payroll of American intelligence. Such revelations can erode trust, even decades later, and potentially upset ongoing trade deals or security partnerships. Thus, the debate churns on. Is the pursuit of historical truth worth the risk of diplomatic fallout? From a broader perspective, these tensions serve as a reminder of how complicated democracy can be. The public wants to trust its leaders but also demands access to facts. Intelligence agencies insist that certain secrets are vital for national defense, yet that cloak can mask questionable actions. The line between legitimate security interests and manipulative secrecy remains razor thin. It's an issue that won't vanish simply because one trove of documents has been declassified. From secret CIA-coded missions like MSLU to entire embassies populated by undercover agents, these newly released files reveal a piece of hidden machinery that shaped world events far more than official narratives let on. We've caught glimpses of coded names, shell companies, suspicious alliances, and the staggering fact that countless diplomats were anything but. The moral questions echo through each page. How far can a government go to safeguard its interests before it crosses a line into outright manipulation? And who decides which regimes should be toppled or allowed to survive behind closed doors? These revelations matter not just for historians with a passion for dusty archives, but for anyone curious about what governments might still be doing under the radar. Even as we piece together clues from 60 years ago, we can't help but wonder what secrets from 10 or 20 years ago remain under lock and key. It's almost certain that more revelations lie ahead. Each is challenging our notions of democracy, transparency, and the rightful balance of power between state and citizen. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration into a world once cloaked in absolute secrecy. If you found this eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you'll stay in the loop whenever new revelations break. And if you're ready to learn about another hidden chapter in recent history, go right ahead and click on the next video on this page. There's always more to uncover, I promise. You won't want to miss it. Remember, it's only by shining a light on these hidden corridors of power that we can truly understand the forces that have molded our world and the forces that might still be shaping our future.